everyone and welcome. Today I'm going to do a non-spoiler review for the Enchanter General trilogy by Dave Duncan. This is an historical fantasy series set in the 12th century of England and it consists of Ironfoot, Trial by Treason and Merlin Redux. So as you can see, these books are quite short. I think that Ironfoot is by far the longest and that one is 330 pages. So the two other ones are below 300 pages and just in general, these are quick, fun and enjoyable reads. So if you are looking for a palate cleanser in between some of the bigger books that adult fantasy has to offer, I would definitely recommend these. I often describe them as Sherlock Holmes if Sherlock Holmes was a wizard living in medieval England. So if that sounds interesting to you, then definitely pick these up. But without further ado, let's get to the review. In these books you follow Derwin. Derwin is a Saxon boy in a country that has been ruled by Normans, so he is often looked down upon by some of his peers, and when we meet Derwin, he is actually being taught to become an enchanter. Now, in this school you have a lot of these enchantment scrolls that do not work, but he is able to correct one of them, and it predicts murder. A couple of days afterwards, a count in a nearby settlement is murdered and Derwin is set to investigate. Now, a lot of people don't think that this is going to be a big plot, which is why they sent just a student, but it immediately appears that more is going on and that there's actually a real plot. So the first book immediately has a murder mystery, which is why I often compare it to Sherlock Holmes, and Derwin also has a sidekick in this one. Then in the second one, you actually also have some sort of mystery that you're trying to comprehend together with Derwin. And in the third one, it's a little bit different. You also have a time jump from the second to the third one, where Derwin in this one, of course, is a lot older and a lot more experienced. Here he's actually helping the king and he goes on a crusade with him, or the crusades, you could say. So you have quite a lot of traveling here. It's not that much mystery, but you definitely have a lot of plotting in this one as well. So for the plot, I actually liked all three of these. I think that if I would have to rank them, it would be very difficult, to be honest. I think that I loved the first one because here you get to meet Derwin when he is just a boy, and this is something that I often like in stories. If you know me, I like Corbin from Malice, I like Fitz from the Farseer trilogy when they are very young and when they are just living in a keep, learning a lot of stuff. I like that setting a lot, so that's why I have fond memories of the first one, and also because I wasn't really expecting anything because I never heard anyone talk about this series, but I actually just loved the covers and that's why I picked it up. But on the other hand, I think that the second one has probably a better mystery, and then the third one I liked a lot because here you of course have Richard Lionheart and the Crusades, which is something, if you like Robin Hood for example, that's something that you know and that's very enjoyable to read. So that's why I like the third one, plus it's very different from the other two. So I can't really pick a favorite. I think that all three of these are quite strong and neck to one another. I think that the book in general and the plot is very fast paced and just, yeah, there's nothing wrong with the story. I wouldn't say that it's exceptional. As I said, these are just quick, fun and enjoyable reads, but I think that you will be pulled into the mystery and will be very curious to see how everything unravels. Even in the third one, where you don't really have that mystery, you still have a lot of plotting and you still want to see how everything unfolds. So yeah, in terms of the story and the plot, I like these three and these definitely get a pass. I never really felt like there was a slower moment or that there was something that wasn't enjoyable, so definitely a plus for me. When we then go over some of the technical aspects and the writing style, then I must say that this is also first person, something that I quite enjoy, past tense, and you follow one POV, you follow Derwin. So what is quite special here, and that's something that you also have in the Farseer trilogy and in some other books that I enjoy quite a lot as well, is that you have Derwin telling you his story of his life. So he's actually an old man when he writes this down, and he's telling you of what he did and the choices that he made in his past. And that's actually quite nice because he often comments on that as well. There are some passages, for example, where he says, I will not excuse my behavior that day, but it's very important to know that this and this happened and that's why I acted that way. And that just makes me feel like somebody is telling me their story. It's definitely very character driven, which I also enjoy. And I really like that style of writing where you have somebody explaining his whole life story. Also because that removes a little bit of the tension that something bad is going to happen, because you know that this person is still alive, of course. But on the other hand, it's quite nice to see the evolution where you have a very young character, somebody who doesn't really know a lot of life, and then you have that same person, but years later in life, commenting on his actions and how he changed and what he would do differently. I quite enjoyed that. What is also very important here is that, of course, this is historical fantasy, and it's very clear that the author knows a lot about this. As I said, these books are very short, so of course do not expect something very dense, a quite elaborate history lesson. But in each of the books he gives a little bit of an explanation of medieval England, of the court, of a lot of the nobles that are present in that time period. But also, for example, how people live in a keep and how things go on there, which is something that I didn't know, even though it's probably very well known in general, the medieval England history. But we often forget, or at least I, that the Middle Ages span a couple of 100 years, and that you don't really have one specific custom for all of those eras. You basically have, in this instance, for example, you have 12th century England, and I didn't really know what was very different from 12th century and 9th century, for example. So that's something that I also really enjoyed, that it's quite clear that the author knows a lot and that he also interjects this into the story. Sometimes he has a complete passage where he quickly explains this to you, the reader, and he also addresses you when he does that, but sometimes it's very neatly woven into the story that you still get this explanation, but it's not really a separate passage. I also like that you do have some fun moments here as well. It's definitely not comedic that you laugh out loud a couple of times, but I did get some chuckles, and just in general it's very light. That's very important to know. This isn't a dense read. The writing style is very accessible. You immediately get drawn into the story, and yeah, these are very fast-paced reads. I never had a dull moment in between. I also think that these are quite safe to pick up if maybe you are feeling a little bit down and you don't want anything that will be very depressing or that has some sad moments, because as far as I remember, you might have a few in here, but definitely not a lot, and in general it's just a very uplifting story. So again, if that's something that you're afraid for, you're quite safe with this trilogy. When we then go over to world building, magical elements, and even a magic system, then of course, like I said, this is historical fantasy, and this stays very close to the source material. You have some historical fantasy series where the authors take some liberties and you really have that setting as a starting point, but the author changes a lot where it's really not very close to the actual history. But I do feel that this is the case here. The author stays very close. You have the kings, for example. You start with Henry II, then you have Richard Lionheart, you have of course John, who is some sort of traitor. If you know England and its history, these are some things that you know, and it stays very close to that. Also, the nobles who were there at the time, the places, they are very well explained, and it's very similar or even exactly the same to what actual history was. So in that case, you of course don't have elaborate world building next to that, but as I said before, as far as the actual history goes, the author does go pretty deep into that, and he also explains all the places that you visit. For example, like I said, when you go to a keep, he will explain how the keep is built up and why that was done at the time, which is very enjoyable just to know and have a little bit of extra knowledge. But it's also nice when Durin then actually walks through that keep that you know the layout. So I do think that the author did that quite well. In terms of traveling, like I said, in the first book you already have some traveling, because Durin of course is in his school, then he knows about this murder that went on in a nearby settlement and he needs to go there. In the second book you have something similar, again traveling to where a mystery plot is happening that he needs to unravel. And then in the third one you have a lot of traveling because he goes to the crusade and he needs to be on board a ship. So you definitely have a lot of different places that you see, and I think that that was very neatly done. And again, very close to being very realistic. For example, when traveling is going on, it's not that they are in Jerusalem after a day of traveling. It does take quite a while to get there. So I do like that. In terms of magical elements, there are none. This is very close to the original. You basically have medieval England. Everything is exactly the same, but you have some sages and you have enchantment that actually works. That's the extent of the magic and the fantasy that you have in this book. But of course, because you are actually following an enchanter himself and you're very close to him, you do have quite a lot of magic. And that's the magic system. So enchantment is the main magic system. I think also the only magic system that is in here. And it's of course very soft magic. If that's something that's not for you, if you dislike having some very convenient moments that happen in a book, then this is definitely going to be here. So be aware that that's going to be the case. But I actually didn't mind, because like I said, this is a very fast paced, this is very light, this isn't dense at all. You don't have a lot of time commitments of these books, and you just need to read them and enjoy them. So I didn't mind that in some instances Derwin all of a sudden had an enchantment all along that I wasn't aware of. Now I must say that this is maybe a couple of times throughout the entire trilogy. Most of the time you are being made aware prior to the event that this is an enchantment that exists, and then later on Derwin uses it. So it's not like it's a huge Deus Ex Machina event that happens every 5 pages. Sometimes it does, but it never really bothered me. But like I said, this is definitely very soft magic, but it does play a very big part in the plot, because if Derwin didn't have this magic, then basically the first book to start with wouldn't have happened. And I really liked how the author interwove the magic system with actual history and how real events took place, but then the author writes it as if Derwin had anything to do with that and if he really changed the course of history. So I like that, and even though the magic is quite soft in this one, and even though you don't really have elaborate world building, even though it takes place in our own world, I think that all of those aspects were handled very well. And then we get to my most enjoyable part of a book, the characters. Now, of course, we will follow Derwin. Derwin is our main POV, it's first person, we will become very connected to him, or at least I did. And I especially liked that you were connected to him and then saw him as an older person, so that even if he made stupid mistakes when he was younger, the older person then immediately saying, yes, I was stupid back then, it does alleviate a lot of that, and it does make you feel for him and understand him in a lot of ways. So I quite like that as well. As I said, this is of course very character driven, because you have the actual history of England, and then you have Derwin, who changes the course of a lot of events. So it's Derwin's personality, it's Derwin's decisions that change a lot of the plot. And I always like character driven books, so I'm here for it. I also like that Derwin, as I said, the first book is called Ironfoot, and that is because Derwin has one foot that is shorter than the other one. He gets picked on that, or because of that, by a lot of the other people who are being taught to become a sage, and then especially also because he is a Saxon. So both of these things do play a role, especially in the first book when he is still a student, but it's never really down, it's just a part that makes his personality, and in general he's just a very happy person. So I quite liked his character. But there are also other people, of course. In the first book you have a mentor, which I quite enjoyed. He was actually a nice person, and the interaction of Derwin with his mentor, Derwin being a very bright person and very fast student, was enjoyable to read about. As I said, I often compare this to Sherlock Holmes because Derwin has a sidekick. He has a sidekick in the first book, the second book, and the third book. And that interaction was also very enjoyable, especially because in the first book, his sidekick is a Norman, and he actually doesn't like Derwin that much. He looks down upon him, and the interaction and how that changes throughout the book was very nice to read about. What I also like is that between the second and the third book, like I said, you have a big time jump. So you have a bunch of new characters in the third book, but you also have some characters that you met in the first book, and then you see again in the third one, and you see what they did with their lives. So I actually also enjoyed that. If we then have to talk about one of the negative aspects, then I would definitely say that representation is pretty meager here. You don't have any representation in general of marginalized groups, but you also have almost no female characters. Now, normally I would definitely see that as a negative, but as I said before, the author chooses to stay very close to actual history. And that being the case, it's actually very realistic that you're not going to have very prominent or a lot of prominent female characters. Because Derwin interacts with scholars, he interacts with kings, he interacts with a lot of noblemen, it's quite clear that women did not have that sort of duty or that sort of place in society at that time. So that's why I didn't really see it as a negative, but just know that if you're looking for that, you're not going to find it here. Of course, you do have some female characters in the first book, in the second book, in the third book, and they do play a small part, but Especially in the first one, it's a little bit cringy. You have a female character, but they don't really interact with Derwin until the very end. And that's a little bit cringy. In the second book, you have an intra-romance, which is also a little bit cringy. And then in the third one, I do think that the representation is a lot better. So maybe that is also the author growing as a writer. And I think that the interaction of Derwin with female characters is a lot better in the third one as well. Now, the romance, as I said, it's a little bit cringy in the second and also in the first one. But since romance is 2% of the entire story, it's not important at all. It's on the side. Again, it's not something that I'm very positive about. It was a negative aspect, but it's so minimal that it didn't really affect my enjoyment of the entire trilogy. But just know that if you're looking for a very good romance, yeah, it's a little bit cringy. So to conclude, if you are looking for a quick, fast and enjoyable read that doesn't take a lot of time, that doesn't take itself too seriously, and that you can basically treat as a palate cleanser, then definitely pick up this series by Dave Duncan. However, if you are looking for some very traditional fantasy, a lot of dense fantasy with a lot of world building and a hard magic system, then this is not something that you're going to find in this series. I would definitely recommend it. I enjoyed all 3 of the books in this series, but of course you need to make up for yourself if you would be interested in them. So that is everything that I wanted to say about them. Please let me know in the comments down below if you are now intrigued and want to pick up Ironfoot, or maybe you've already read the entire series. And if that's the case, then also let me know what you thought. As always, I hope that you enjoyed the video and see you next time. Bye!